Well, welcome everybody to this Concerned Veterans for America policy conversation. My name is Nate Anderson. I'm an Army veteran and executive director at Concerned Vets for America. If you haven't checked us out or heard about us, check out our website at cv4a.org, cv4a.org. Check it out, learn a little bit about us. We're on social media also. And so tonight we're here to talk about Iraq, about the wars in the Middle East. And it's a very important, timely conversation, I think. Just over the weekend, a couple of days ago, marked the 18-year anniversary of the invasion of the US invasion in Iraq. And 18 years is a pretty significant milestone for any war. But for us, this is very timely. And there's definitely a lot for us to talk about, both about the conflict itself, what led to it, and also some of the contributing factors that are still with us as we deal with these conflicts overseas. So I have some special guests with me to discuss this tonight. And first, I want to welcome Jason Beardsley. Jason is the executive director of the Association of the United States Navy, or AUSN. Jason's both a Navy veteran and an Army veteran, and he retired as a Green Beret Master Sergeant from the US Army. His 22-year military career includes 15 years with Army Special Operations and Joint Special Operations. And his public service includes time as Special Assistant in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, as well as Senior Advisor to the Secretary of the Department of Veterans Affairs, and as the Veteran Service Organization Liaison. Jason, thanks for taking some time to be here.
Yeah, Nate, thank you for having me. I appreciate this forum. And as you said, it's very timely. So looking forward to a great discussion.
Absolutely. Also joining us is Dan Caldwell. Dan is the Foreign Policy Campaign Manager for Stand Together, as well as a Senior Advisor for Concerned Veterans for America. Dan enlisted in 2005 into the United States Marine Corps as an infantryman and served as a member of the Marine Corps Security Force Marine Barracks in Washington, as well as the presidential retreat at Camp David. Dan later deployed to Iraq with 2nd Battalion 1st Marines in support of our Operation Iraqi Freedom. And after his service in uniform, Dan worked for Congressman David Schweikert of Arizona as the Deputy Chief of Staff, where he also ran a successful re-election campaign for the representative in 2012. Dan, good to see you. Thanks for being on.
Nate, thanks for having me.
Well, definitely a lot to talk about. 18 years ago, the U.S. invaded Iraq, and so my first question is, 18 years is a pretty long time, and I'm curious where each of you were 18 years ago, just what you remember experiencing as you heard about this invasion in Iraq. Jason, I'll start with you.
Thanks, Nate. You mentioned 18 years, of course. Many of us have had children grow up in that time frame, and it does remind us how long we've been at this. At the time, of course, I was already through my Special Forces training, and a lot of us were very emotionally, I think, poised to do what was necessary to protect and really defend the principles of the United States of America. And at the time, obviously, we'd come off of already having invaded Afghanistan, and now the sort of compounded or layered sort of approach to how we got to Iraq. And I remember a lot of us, I think, at least for my generation and those that served along me, we're eager to help in any way we can. We're ready to do the rest of the work. I think we set out on a course that in our minds felt good at the time, or felt right at the time. And then, we'll talk about the ensuing years after that. But I would say that a lot of us were ready to do our service to the country. We're very proud of that. So,
indeed, yeah. Dan, what do you remember 18 years ago?
Yeah, so one kind of image sticks in my mind, and I was actually traveling. I was still in high school, and I was traveling for a high school robotics competition. And I know some of you are probably laughing at that. It was not BattleBots, but it was pretty fun. And I remember being at a hotel in Houston, Texas, with everybody on my robotics team watching the statue of Saddam Hussein pulled down in Fido Square by, it was later revealed to be the 1st Marine Tank Battalion and 3rd Battalion, 4th Marines, part of the 7th Marine Regiment out of 29 Palms, California. And I remember seeing that, and it was a big moment. And I think in that moment, a lot of folks thought, okay, the war was quick. It was bloody. You know, you had the incident with Jessica Lynch, you had the Battle of Nasiriyah. It was a tough war in the invasion, but a lot of folks thought, okay, it's over now. We're going to start coming home. Iraq's going to be fine. And in that moment, there was this kind of brief, fleeting feeling that this could work out. And obviously, the coming weeks and months and years would show that that's not the case. For me, at that point, I had a group of friends in high school that all of us were interested in military service. And so, you know, we are all very closely following this, and we were following certain units. And so we were all very plugged into what's happening. But it's that particular moment that really kind of sticks out to me. And really, in my mind, and we're going to probably talk more about this as this program progresses, but that really kind of was the moment now, knowing what I know, where we really lost the war. So I think that's why it sticks out in my mind in particular.
Just a follow-up to that, Jason mentioned how this I guess the service mentality at that point was, you know, coming out of 9/11, there was this rally around the flag attitude with a lot of young Americans. It's part of the reason that I joined the Army. I'm just curious, what made you want to join the Marine Corps during a time of 2 conflicts simultaneous? What kind of drove you to that decision?
Well, I think growing up, you know, I had 2 grandfathers that were in the service. Both of them were Army. And I really was into military history. You know, I was one of those kids that would go to Barnes and Noble and I'd get a book about the Marines. I'd get like the Jane's aircraft identification, the Jane's ship identification. Even though I wound up being a grunt, I'm pretty good. I can, you know, I know the difference between like a MiG-29 and an Su-27. I think I could probably figure out what that ship is behind Jason and his background. But so I was really into that. And I started reading a lot about the history of the Marine Corps and kind of their history, their pride as the smallest, yet, you know, in their minds, obviously the toughest service. You know, talking to 2 Special Forces veterans, obviously we maybe have some disagreements about that, but their attitude as a service really kind of spoke to me. And so I was already kind of hooked even prior 9/11, and in my mind thinking, okay, I'm going to go in the Marine Corps. And I think that both 9/11 and, to be frank, the Iraq War kind of really encouraged that decision as I was, you know, graduating high school and briefly entering college before I enlisted.
Yeah, it's a very similar story to mine, in fact. But Jason, going back to you, another kind of personal question. Given your extensive experience, both in special operations, but a very diverse experience overseas, I'm curious what that experience as sort of a practitioner of U.S. foreign policy, how that influenced your points of view around foreign policy and America's role in the world. What kind of influence did that have on you?
Nate, that's a great question. You know, I started my career in the Navy during the Persian Gulf War, and in a way that had a pretty impactful sort of impression, I think, on a lot of us. We got in, we did the objective, and then we managed to get out. And so there was this real feeling, this sense of accomplishment and credit to the military institution, training, leadership. So by the time we roll through some of the 90s and then come past 9/11, we have a pretty good confidence, I think, at large in the disposition of forward deployed troops. And, you know, we are the best trained military in the world. We've got incredible people that volunteer for this. And so as you think about it, at least as I thought about it, I felt like we were prepared. I was sitting in Kuwait before the invasion, and I was on a team at that point with other Special Forces soldiers, and we were ready to go in. And I think we're living off the sort of the previous successes we've had as a nation, and knowing the amount of care and just training that has been poured into us. So all told, we had a trust in the leadership and the policymakers and the decision makers that these kind of decisions would be fruitful and would be, let's call it efficient or optimized, right? Because we had the right tools, we had the right talent, we had the right sort of resources behind us. And it felt like really nothing could stop us, especially after what we saw in the initial stages of Afghanistan. And then as we got into Iraq, you know, these began to unfold, I think to your point and Dan's really, in a way that you started to feel some confidence that our policymakers and decision makers were on the cusp of getting this right. And of course, we're challenged with the history of sort of foreign exploits, particularly in those tough regions. Afghanistan, you know, takes the cake for that. So there's a little bit of that fear in the background that if we don't close with and destroy the enemy quickly and affect the sort of foreign policy on the ground, we could get dragged in for a little while. But that started to creep as we were there a little bit longer. So initially, confidence that erodes over time. So.
Indeed. Great segue to my next question. I mean, the decision to invade Iraq in 2003, extremely controversial. And there's been so much debate, litigation, relitigation, scrutinizing the decision to even invade in the first place. And in hindsight, it's pretty clear that there were some oversights in the justification that was used, right? And I say hindsight because everything is more clear in hindsight. So my first question to you, Dan, on this topic, can you take us down memory lane a little bit? How did the political debate in the United States lead to this point where we authorized this unprovoked invasion into such a faraway land?
Yeah, I think that this is a very important question. And I think you have to go back and really start at the end of the first Persian Gulf War. In particular, I'm not talking about Desert Storm, I'm talking about the Iran-Iraq War. So during the Iran-Iraq War, which was a war between Iran, which had just been gone through a revolution, the Islamic revolution, you had the Ayatollahs and mullahs running Iran. They fought a war with Saddam Hussein's Iraq for 8 years, and it was the longest conventional war of the 20th century. It was very brutal, it was very bloody. You had many of the nations of the world get involved indirectly or directly. And ultimately that shaped kind of the future of the Middle East in a lot of different ways. And during that conflict, the United States was mostly backing Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Now, there's some myths around what we actually did for Saddam. You know, you've had some people like Michael Moore say that we armed Iraq and that we were their chief supporter. That's not entirely accurate. We kind of had an uneasy shared interest in ensuring that Iran didn't win that war, because Iran was a country that was very hostile to the United States. And they'd held American diplomats hostage. They were connected to bombings against US Marines in places like Lebanon. So we had a shared interest in ensuring that Iran didn't win the war. So once that war ended, Saddam Hussein's Iraq was in massive amounts of debt. They were economically challenged, and Saddam needed to have an external enemy to really distract his people. So he invaded Kuwait, and there was a fear that he was going to invade Saudi Arabia, and at that point, likely control 50% of the world's energy resources. So the United States assembled an international coalition with the United Nations, went in and kicked Saddam out of Kuwait, instituted very harsh sanctions on his country, set up no-fly zones, really with the goal of containing him. Now, while that happened, the Soviet Union collapsed. America won the Cold War. We had defeated international communism and smashed the international communist bloc. So at that point, we were at a crossroads in American foreign policy, and there was a decision whether or not to really focus American foreign policy towards what really is required to keep us safe and secure and preserve the conditions of our prosperity. So really having a narrow focus on that, or do we move towards this really unipolar moment where America is the world superpower, and do we become the world's policeman as a result? And we chose that path as the world's policeman, and it was a bipartisan decision. You had both Republicans and Democrats supporting that move. And so during the 90s, you had this increasing belief among American policymakers that we will always be the world's superpower and that it's in our interest to be the world's policeman. And so there was a lot of energy around, what is used to justify that role as the world's policeman. And so to justify that, you needed bad guys. And one very obvious bad guy was Saddam Hussein's Iraq. And make no mistake, he was an evil individual. He was a terrible person who did terrible things to his people. At various points during his reign, he did support terrorism and generally was just an absolute brutal dictator. But during the 90s and leading up to 9/11, you really had this movement of Americans that began to lay the groundwork to conduct a regime change in Iraq. And saying that Iraq was this threat, they were a threat not only to the Middle East, but also to the United States mainland, because they were developing supposedly weapons of mass destruction, missiles, because they were supporting terrorism. So then 9/11 happens. And 9/11 happens, and in the Bush administration, you had some people assume key roles within the administration who had long supported regime change in Iraq. People like Paul Wolfowitz, Douglas Feith, Richard Pearl on the Defense Policy Board, and then people in Vice President Cheney's office. And they had come in to this administration, and actually, they were at first a minority voice because there were a lot of people in the Bush administration that did not share this belief that we should be the world's policeman in the sense that we should be going around and trying to instill our values in other countries. But those individuals used 9/11 to ultimately start building a case within the Bush administration and then in the public sphere for invading Iraq. And there were really three key justifications for going into Iraq. And the first two really dealt directly with our safety and our security. The first was the threat of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. After 1991, after the victory in the Gulf War, Saddam Hussein was forced to give up his weapons of mass destruction by the United Nations. And there were a series of on and off weapons inspections to determine whether or not he had eliminated his chemical weapons, biological weapons, and nuclear weapons capability. And there was always this assumption that he hadn't completely eliminated it and that he was hiding something. However, there was never firm evidence that he actually was in possession of a significant chemical weapons or biological weapons or nuclear weapons capability. The intelligence was always very thin. However, some of these individuals within the Bush administration who wanted to overthrow Saddam Hussein, who wanted to go to war with Iraq, worked to manipulate and to amplify this intelligence, very thin intelligence, that Saddam did have weapons of mass destruction, and most importantly, posed a threat to the United States and the region as a whole. And you heard this line from people in the Bush administration saying, well, the evidence that Saddam has a nuclear bomb will be a mushroom cloud. And so you had a lot of stories that were turned out later to be based on unreliable sources, including people that were literally on drugs or had alcohol problems, or in some cases were sex offenders, about these like biological mobile weapons vans. And none of that wound up to be true. And really what happened is that this intelligence was manipulated. People at the CIA were pressured to change their conclusions and ultimately create this case for an Iraq that posed this threat to the United States. So then the second reason was Saddam Hussein's connection to Al-Qaeda, the implication being that him and his people had a hand in 9/11. And in reality, Saddam Hussein really was on the opposite end of the spectrum from the radical Islamists that were affiliated with Al-Qaeda. He was more of a secular Arab socialist leader. He did at times tolerate groups operating within Iraq that were Islamic radicals, but more often than not, he viewed them as a threat. So it wasn't a natural alliance, but yet you had some of these same people that were pushing these lies about WMDs come and say that, Saddam's connected to Al-Qaeda. There's Al-Qaeda operatives in Iraq. He's training Al-Qaeda operatives at these bases, when in reality, The Al-Qaeda operatives that were in Iraq were actually in parts of the country that Saddam didn't control. And some of these bases that they were saying were being used to train the Al-Qaeda operatives were actually used by Iraqi counterterrorism forces to fight Al-Qaeda. So that intelligence was, again, manipulated, and that case for war was oversold. But the third one, which really drove a lot of the motivation for people pushing the Iraq war, was this belief that if you overthrew Saddam and turned Iraq into this functioning liberal democracy, that liberal democracy would spread throughout the Middle East. And I don't need to explain how false that turned out to be. Obviously, that did not happen. The Middle East, in many ways, became more repressive, less stable. And if you look at Iraq today, it is far from an ideal liberal democracy. In many ways, it's a gangster state. So that's ultimately how we got to the decision in 2003 to invade. And really, if I had to just close off and say that it was one of the biggest problems was this kind of delusional belief about what American power can do and what the purpose of American military power is in our foreign policy. And at the end of the day, we have a military to keep us safe and defend our national interests and the conditions of our economic prosperity. It is not a tool to reshape the world. And that was the fundamental delusion that led us into the Iraq war.
Thank you, Dan. Jason, I want to give you a chance to respond a little bit about the path that brought us there.
Yeah, thanks. By the way, Dan, a great kind of travel across a few of the decades. I think you laid the groundwork well. I think there's some additional layers that kind of help walk us as a people into the sort of emotional state where we're ready to back our leaders. And then I want to end by kind of talking about that delusional leadership and kind of give a little grace, but I'll explain myself. But first, going back a little, I think you established a really good groundwork for the Iran-Iraq war. I think even leading up to that, what we as the United States witnessed for decades, really going back to the early 70s, were increasing violent outbreaks from small guerrilla insurgent type movements, terrorists, and they were internationally sponsored and networked. And over 3 and 4 decades, that became more and more evident, which is why we stood up task force to hunt bin Laden prior to 9/11. It's why we lost the Khobar Towers, the World Trade Center bomb back in '93, I believe it was, USS Cole. All of these things are happening in the lead up to this. And in addition to that, from the time we kind of completed our objective in the Persian Gulf War, all the way through out of the post 9/11 experience, we have Saddam Hussein violating no-fly zones, attacking the Kurds in the north. We have his, helicopters that were supposed to be sort of neutered, and he was able to use those to offend against a minority people. So a lot of those things went into the arguments that were laid down in front of the United Nations. And I think the combined sort of premise by the time we are invading in 2003 is that this would be an opportunity for the United States and the Western powers at large to present some stability inside the region that was clearly starting to kind of unravel the tension between the major factions. And I think some folks saw that as an opportunity to sort of reset the table. And finally, so you take the kind of the terrorism and the layers of increasing violence against United States targets, and you have a nice centralized location where you can demonstrate a little bit of U.S. projection of power. Now, to give a little sense on that delusional sort of mindset where we go to change the world or rebuild or reshape nations, what I really think we have to look at is where we as a people to kind of weigh in and help kind of govern the policymakers, help steer them in the directions. Now, I think when we look back at the early invasion time, there was conflict at the time. There were plenty of people that raised their hands and their voices against this. There were some who went along for a little while, and then as we get into the conflict, began to kind of peel back their support. What we never really got to was a place where the body politic, the American voice, so to speak, weighed in such a degree that Congress or the presidents at the time, whichever presidents they were, or different representatives felt the weight of the American voice on top of them to animate a spirit of either go forward and complete or withdraw and take away your wins that you've got. And by the way, I think it's one of the great purposes for what you're doing at Concerned Veterans for America, what we do here at the Association of the United States Navy, and really where the veteran service organizations play a role. If the press isn't sharing our voice, the members' voice, veterans, folks who went down and walked that path or spent time, sacrificed blood or limbs or treasure to be there, if we're not carrying that voice into the legislators, they're more than happy to pass the buck and to continue to kind of duck and dodge responsibility, which goes, Nate, to one of your questions about the authorized use of military force versus the war powers. So I would just suggest that one of the things we do if we're leading groups of veterans, as we are in this case, is we capture the voice of experience and we ensure that we amplify it and advocate for where, let's say, the wisdom of the people, the consent of the governed ought to be. And I think that's a place where we can be stronger and demonstrate leadership. And frankly, Dan and Nate, I'll leave it to you to comment on, but I think sometimes that's lacking. We have advocacy, but a lot of times it's pointed kind of granular, sort of benefits or how do we take care of veterans. But the global picture, the big national strategy, that's one I think we owe our members and veterans at large who have served. So I'll leave that there.
Yeah, no, thank you, Jason. First off, I think there's so many lessons that we can take out of this experience in hindsight and apply toward future decisions around military engagement for the United States. But you bring up such a great point about the need for veterans, people, their family members also, to have their voice heard. And that is exactly why Concerned Vets for America even exists. Our mission is to advocate for policy, but give those individuals who have skin in the game and who have had these experiences, this tacit experience of U.S. foreign policy abroad. We give them a platform. We help them make their voice heard, and it's a powerful voice because lawmakers listen. Our society listens to veterans because there's a great deal of trust there. So I'm so glad you brought that up, Jason. Thank you. I want to pause real quick for anybody joining us late. Welcome. I'm Nate Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of Concerned Vets for America. We're here talking about the 18-year anniversary of the Iraq War. We're about to talk a little bit about war powers and these authorizations for use of military force. With me is Jason Beardsley, both a Navy and Army veteran and current Executive Director at the Association of the United States Navy, as well as Dan Caldwell, Senior Advisor to Concerned Veterans for America and a Marine Corps veteran. Gentlemen, I want to talk a little bit about the Constitution because you knew we were going here. So Article 1 of the Constitution really explicitly gives Congress the power to declare war. That's very important here. And I think a lot of people would say that one of the most fundamental and important votes that any representative elected to federal office could make is the decision to send a young man or young woman into harm's way. That's a big responsibility. Unfortunately, Congress has kind of shirked its responsibility in that area, and a lot of the decisions it's left up to the President of the United States of both parties, the executive branch. Jason, kind of in principle, why do you think that congressional oversight and just generally a debate in U.S. foreign policy is something that's so important, regardless of who the president is? Why is that such an important principle for us to hold on to?
Well, that's really the frame of why we do this. Those representatives carry the weight of the people on their shoulders. And when they're not held accountable, again, to the voice of the people, they can pass by guardrails pretty fast. And when you talked about kind of letting go of the responsibility, a lot of us see this as your job is to be there and cast that difficult vote. When you talked about a legislator making that decision, having the weight on his shoulders, it's much easier for he or she to pass that weight along and say, well, it's not our fault. We support our troops, and have this kind of expandable authorized use of military force, which is a little vague and a little fuzzy, and it allows for them to cheer if we're winning, and then sort of, decry if we're losing, and lay the blame at the foot of the White House. Okay, so it seems to me you have very few people in Congress that are making a consistent argument that we ought to be discussing this. You mentioned that this is an important dialogue. The problem is it's not being had. In the halls of Congress, we rarely discuss, should we be there? What is the purpose for being there? What does the exit strategy look like? And some of those things you don't reveal in public, but we owe the American people, the leadership does, the seniors in the military owe the American people a really simple explanation about what are we doing there? What's the purpose? And when do we know we've achieved our objective, so that mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters and everybody can send their sons and daughters into harm's way, feeling confident that the decision was made, come to, in a deliberate manner. What we've got right now is an extension upon an extension upon an extension, and a very, let's call it thready or weak or anemic sort of justification. So that at this point, and you guys both know this, the military, which is a very small percentage of the population, something under 2%, closer to 1% of the people have someone in their immediate family serving. So we're not touching as many people as probably need to be touched by the voice of the veterans coming back. Again, that's the mission I think you have. And I think that's the mission we have here, is to ensure that our voice is elevated. If we don't do that, that 1% of the population, it's a math problem. Nobody's really heard it. The cost doesn't affect them. We've been in, we just passed a $1.3 trillion budget, so they're not hurting by that. And if it's 1%, very few people know an injured veteran or someone who passed because of the war. So I think that becomes incumbent upon us to kind of make the argument and amplify or advocate for that voice. I'm going to probably keep coming back to that, because that's the point here with our audience. Anybody listening, the real point is Congress is going to get away with whatever we let them get away with. And we, the veterans, ought to be leading this dialogue such that everyone is either put their chips on the table and said, yes, go forward and continue, or you know what, I can't justify it. Let's look at a means to kind of extract. So.
Yeah, no, that's a terrific point. I mean, there's a significant responsibility here. Dan, why is it that we're seeing this abdication, this shirking of responsibility of men and women in Congress? Why is it so difficult for them to do their job, I guess you could say, in the simplest terms?
Well, I was going to give two reasons, but I think Jason identified, frankly, one of the biggest reasons, and maybe it's an uncomfortable truth. It's because we've let them get away with it. And I think it's on us to really hold them accountable. And that's why it's important to get involved with groups like Concerned Veterans for America and really make your voice heard in this process. That's important. The American people need to get more energized by it. But I think there's really two other reasons. I think that the first one is there's kind of part of this larger pattern where Congress is really kicking the can or punting on a lot of its responsibilities, not just around war powers, but around spending, around the budgeting process, around letting regular order return to things on the floor. Like, there's not a lot of votes on amendments to bills. There's not a lot of debate in committee. Really, I've talked to a lot of members of Congress and a lot of senators who are just miserable right now, because in a lot of ways, what happens is leadership, just like with the bill that Jason alluded to, just puts together a bill in a back room, drops it on the floor and says, vote for it. If you don't, we're not going to support your reelection. You're not part of the team, blah, blah, blah. And next thing you know, it's passed through the dead of night. And there's not a lot of debate. There's not a lot of things that Congress was intended to do and really is responsible for based on the Constitution. And so you see that playing out not just with war powers, but with a whole host of other issues. And the third reason is, and it's really, you got to bear with me on this one, but really two words, and that's Hillary Clinton. Now, why Hillary Clinton? Why did I bring her up? I know that she's a very divisive figure and a lot of people blame her for a lot of stuff, but I bring her up because you have to look at her 2008 and 2016 presidential run. And there's very good evidence that she lost both races because of her vote for the 2002 authorization for use of military force, which authorized the Iraq War. And that was a major issue. That was a major differentiation between her and Barack Obama in the 2008 Democrat primary. And Donald Trump, President Trump, raked her over the coals in 2016 because of that vote. And there's real academic evidence conducted by two political scientists that showed that Donald Trump's victory in 2016 was related to him being viewed as the more anti-interventionist, restrained candidate compared to Hillary Clinton, who had supported not just Iraq, but the disastrous intervention in Libya. She was the lead cheerleader of that. You think of what happened with the annex at Benghazi. That was a direct result of the decision, very bad one, to overthrow Gaddafi. She supported arming the Syrian rebels, and she'd been on the wrong side of almost every major foreign policy issue in the post 9/11 world. So there was real evidence that she lost both those races because of that. So you have a lot of members of Congress who want to be senators, or senators who want to be presidents, and they don't want to have to take tough votes. They don't want to have, to vote for an intervention or a war that could go the wrong way, and they're being held accountable to it. Now, in my mind, the right thing to do is to, study the issue, debate it, look at all the facts, and make the decision based on what you think is best for the country. But the reality is that most members of Congress right now don't want to take those tough votes. They don't want to do the hard work of debating things in committee or voting on amendments. God forbid they have to listen to a standing talking filibuster or go through a vote-a-rama, for 28 or 30 hours on different amendments. They just don't want to do that work. And a lot of that tears up too into their fear of not being able to advance because they have to take a tough vote, and they don't want to have their political career ended by that one tough vote, just like happened in a lot of ways with Hillary Clinton.
So despite what Jason's saying about, I'm getting a little bit of echo. I don't know if that's maybe me on my end or maybe one of you gentlemen. Despite what Jason's saying about veterans needing to have their voices heard a little bit more, kind of this lack of public debate on this very important issue. Dan, you're saying that there are still consequences for politicians in real terms, in re-election terms, in a political sense for what they do or don't do.
That's correct. And to tie in what Jason said, it's up to us to create those consequences. I think ultimately this dynamic in Congress is going to change when they view it as there's a bigger political disincentive to not vote or not support transparency and oversight around these issues than there is to continue the status quo. So we at Concerned Veterans for America and other groups, we really need to get out there and put the pressure on Congress to say, look, you need to do your job. You need to repeal these outdated authorizations. If you think that we need to be involved in, say, Somalia, you can't rely on the 2001 authorization for use of military force, which is targeted at Afghanistan. You have to put a new authorization on the floor and debate it and put your name on the record supporting or opposing it. That's how the founders envisioned it working. And I think that type of public debate and that type of accountability will ultimately create a better foreign policy. But it's really on us and other groups to create that pressure to ensure that it happens.
Yeah.
Jason, you've been in government. You've sort of been on the advocacy side of this dynamic, as well as in a government seat to witness it. What's your perspective on that? The sort of that political ramification?
Yeah, this is it's a good insight when you're inside the system to know how effective stakeholders and outside voices can be, but they have to be shaped and they have to be have the ability to speak into an administration, whether that's DOD or Veterans Affairs. When they do, when groups like the Association of the United States Navy or Concerned Vets for America, when they coalesce people, members, veterans who have served there, and we bring our voice together, whether it's calling into congressmen or senators or visiting administrative undersecretaries and assistant secretaries, they hear that And the more they hear it, the more compelling the case becomes. So the onus, again, I think falls on us and any of the groups out there that are leading veterans and want to take advantage of the voices and make sure those voices get into the right people. It has to be persistent. It has to be done over time. It's not a kind of a fly-by-night gig. And you all know this because you've been doing it for many years now. And we feel the same way. Folks that have served in the Marine Corps or the Navy or the Coast Guard, they ought to be heard inside, not just the halls of Congress, but in particular on the legislative side, when Congress passes the law, it gets implemented, the administrations are implementing that, whether it's veterans benefits or whether it's Department of Defense policy. When we don't make ourselves known to them or heard to them, they're operating kind of in the blind at the behest of what you've already described as kind of a laid back Congress. So we want to get them from laid back to leaning forward and listening to everyone out there that actually has a stake in this. And sometimes it's just as easy as coming into a session like this and then saying, hey, what can I do? What can we do? And then generating policy papers or letters or making sure they get handed off to the right people. Some of our legislators need your voice to back them. When someone goes up and questions the AUMF or questions our war power or questions, what are we doing in Iraq or Afghanistan? We can take that voice and kind of shape it and turn it into kinetic energy. Right now, the best part of the story is it's bipartisan. We've had, Republican presidents and Democrat presidents, Republican and Democrat, and you see kind of the same habitual things, which is the stasis. I think one of you mentioned that. So to get them out of stasis, being comfortable where they are, we have to take that 1% and turn it into what feels like a constant drumbeat inside. And I will tell you that they don't mind hearing it. When they're told fairly what the voice of the people represents, they can listen. We just have to show them it's meaningful. So I think that means the work is on us. It's not easy to do. If we could have all veteran service organizations at least rally around this, we'd have we'd have answers. And we don't have to come with notions, if you will. If we want to stay in Iraq, okay, tell us why. If we want to stay in Afghanistan, make the case. But we should at least be able to get our leaders to cough up what that case is and lay out a clear vision. Our military does best when they know what the objective is. Our military does best when they have a description of how do we achieve victory, because we have the best men and women in arms in the entire history of the world. They will do the job, but you got to spell out what it is.
Absolutely. What I'm hearing from you is that advocacy works and people listen when you speak up. It's a very powerful realization for I think definitely veterans, but Americans writ large. I think that's something that's a real message of empowerment that I think people should take to heart and not be intimidated to have their voice heard. So I want to talk a little bit about these authorizations for use of military force. If you're joining us late, welcome. I am Nate Anderson, Executive Director of Concerned Vets for America, joined by Dan Caldwell and Jason Beardsley. We've been having a discussion about the 18-year anniversary of Iraq, congressional war powers, and the abdication there of the constitutional responsibility that Congress has had. I want to pivot and talk about specifically these authorizations that Congress has passed. So speaking of the 2002 AUMF, less than a fifth of the current representatives in Congress even voted for that measure, less than a fifth of it. And it was really passed specifically to authorize operations against the government of Iraq. And so Dan, I'll go to you first. There's a ongoing initiative right now to repeal the 2002 AUMF. Do you see this as something that is within the realm of the possible? Could this actually happen here in the near future?
Yes, I do. I think that there is overwhelming bipartisan support for repealing the 2002 AUMF. You have several bills in Congress right now that would do just that, and I believe all of them have bipartisan support. I think there are 60 votes in the Senate, and I think that it will easily pass the House. Now, the wild card, frankly, is what is the Biden administration going to do? Now, they have said that they support a repeal of the 2002 AUMF. I would just say that the Obama administration, where many of the Biden administration leaders served, also supported the repeals of these AUMF, but didn't put a lot of muscle behind getting them passed, and ultimately used those AUMFs to justify conflicts far afield from Iraq and the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, or from fighting the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. So my concern is that while right now the Biden administration is supportive, there might be people within the administration that might slowly start tapping the brakes and say, okay, we maybe want to keep this on the books because we might need to use it to justify staying in Iraq or fighting back against certain proxies in Syria. And so there is a danger that there's a limited window to accomplish it, and this could close as the administration drags on. Now, all that to say, I am very optimistic, though, that we can get something done around this. There's really unprecedented bipartisan support for repealing the 2002 AUMF, and then also taking a look at the 2001 AUMF as well, too.
Yeah, it's encouraging. That's good to hear. This question would be for both of you. You know, if a repeal was to occur, and maybe someday soon we can also look at that 2001 AUMF, which is the more serious culprit of abuse legally. You know, what would a more responsible authorization for force look like if we could learn the lessons that we've been talking about? You know, what would we apply in terms of specifics to that authorization, to that specific language that would prevent this slippery slope that we've fallen prey to as a country? For either of you.
Well, I like that Dan laid out a great case for why there's kind of optimism, but couched in what Dan said too was a really good warning that if you pass these things or repeal one and bring another one to the table, if you don't have enough teeth in it, it lacks the sort of force of will, if you will. So it really has to be bought off on by the people that will implement it. We're going to find those at the senior levels of the military. And for folks not as familiar with what this is, it's just a legal instrument, but it's kind of tantamount to a hall pass for the president or the military to kind of take on objectives sort of on the fly, if you will. So the way to make it better, you can see it actually in the writing in the early writing of these things. It's bound by geographies or bound by organizations that we're able to go after. And those are the things that get amended through time or just kind of watered down a little bit, stretched out. This happens to be one of the most flexible documents constitutionally available to the powers to be able to kind of go where they need and do what they want. So you're really challenging the stasis of DC power, the DC elite. And I would say if we took any lesson, it would be something like, again, I'm going to keep going back to the people. If we let off the gas, if we go easy on our elected representatives, it doesn't matter what piece of legislation or legal instrument they craft, they'll take that in directions we never thought of, because these are hard to get right all the way. What really happens is if we don't hold them accountable, as we keep saying, they're going to use it as a license to operate. To restrict them, we have to go all the way back to the war powers, but I think we can all admit Congress has really shied away from using those war powers and are unlikely to do so. Here's the real danger. The danger is today, and after 20 years of doing this, we're facing an unidentifiable enemy who, without uniform, is different than what a combatant was in our previous sort of war type history. And so now we're identifying extremists by their thoughts, by their ideas. So we've kind of converted from a state on state war footing to more of a policing, which kind of relates more to kind of legislature, crime. And when we're caught in this hybrid as a military, you've got military folks who are executing things along the sort of vague and ambiguous line, this sort of elusive concept of what is the enemy. And then you start to see that the enemy can be anyone once we identify the ideology. That's a dangerous place for the military to be, because it causes military service members to have to be accountable to know your ideas, which is a pretty tricky thing to do. Married 25 years, I'm still having trouble with that. So the idea that we can trust them kind of carte blanche is a little bit difficult. And again, it just comes right back to the reason why we're here tonight, which is get involved. If you served, bring your voice, let someone shepherd that into DC. Plenty of great organizations. If you have the experience, or you just want to make sure that Congress is hearing you, your families, then come in, join us, be together. We'll shape that, hopefully find the right outlets for it. But we need to hear from our veterans. I mean, 1% of the population, we've got to make noise in order to be heard.
Yeah. So I'm hearing debate and bottom-up accountability, Jason. Dan, what else could we apply to this problem that we're facing to avoid it in the future of these AUMFs?
So to add on what Jason said about the geographic limits being within these pieces of legislation, and then naming groups and having other, very specific focuses within the legislation, I think are important. But I think in addition to that, one of the biggest things that needs to be in this legislation in the future are sunsets. There needs to be a sunset that I think it shouldn't go more than 2 years, because this forces the Congress to re-examine it. Or if they can't get their act together and debate on it, then it expires, and you don't have the situation like you have with the 2001 and 2002 AUMF, where it is being used and abused by the executive branch to justify an ever-growing war that is, less connected to our safety and security, and which is not receiving the proper oversight from Congress, and therefore is not really being connected by the American people to what we need to do to keep us safe. But even broader than just the congressional side of things, which is important and which is critical, I think that there needs to be a broader re-examination of what it means to keep America safe in the public sphere. There needs to be a broader marketplace of ideas around foreign policy. And I think that going back to how I talked about how we got to the Iraq War, there was this bipartisan foreign policy consensus that emerged after the victory in the Cold War that really, if you looked at it from a 50,000-foot view, there really wasn't much difference between the Republican foreign policy establishment and Democrat foreign policy establishment. And that got us into Iraq under President Bush, and then Libya under President Obama. And so it was a bipartisan failure. And what we really need to do is challenge a lot of these assumptions that have driven our foreign policy for the last 30 years. And really, it's not about making America weaker or saying that America needs to gut its military. I think that a lot of people in the debate assume that's what we're talking about. But ultimately, I would turn it around and say that the foreign policy that we've had the last 30 years has made us less safe. It's distracted us from more pressing priorities here at home and abroad. So I think that's even bigger than this AUMF discussion, which is incredibly important, is that we need to fundamentally challenge the foreign policy that has driven us in the post-Cold War era. And I'm happy to say is that's really starting to happen, but there's still a lot of kind of inertia that is pushing us in the wrong direction in many places. And hopefully part of this will be these reexaminations of congressional war powers, which will be essential to putting us on a new path regarding foreign policy.
What happens if attempts to repeal these authorizations fail? What happens if this reinterpretation of authorizations is allowed to continue into the foreseeable future as the global landscape continues to change? What's at stake? What are we looking at if that happens?
Yeah, first, let me just say, I think what Dan said about sunsetting these pieces is really good. I appreciate that, because they do need a time to end so we can go back and re-examine. So your question, Nate, about what happens if we don't circumscribe these or define them better? And the answer is more of the same. We have a stasis that's already sort of presented itself over the last 18, 20 years. People are very comfortable with this because a lot of people aren't touched, again, by military experience. And so it's left to the few of us to sort of exemplify a voice of what is potentially frustration. The military has a sort of a sense that we're not winning wars anymore. We're going to continue down that path, but there's an added level of tension because right now the Department of Defense, that just came out of there, has really begun to refocus its mindset on the horizon of great power competition. What does that mean? Well, that means they're starting to look more at threats of nation states like China and Russia and some of the emerging or near peer type rivals. And what that looks like to us in the military is you got to be prepared to fight the combatant warfare we think we know from sort of, let's call it the mid 19th century or so, mid 20th century. So to do that, you've got to make a decision. Do we want to be in small wars and draining sort of resources, logistics, supply chains to support those few people on the ground in places that we haven't really explained well? Or do we want to kind of amplify kind of the energy it takes to stand up against a China, to stand up against a potential emergent Russia, and to be able to provide America a reasonable sort of projection of power without getting drained in the kind of small war conflict zone? So the tension that we're facing right now is significant. If we don't do something different, we'll be coming back to this discussion over and over again because we will have to face multiple threats, changing environment, asymmetric warfare, small wars, while also doing big wars. And so far, we haven't really shown that we're very focused and capable of doing that. So I think that's the danger ahead if we're not careful about how we legislate this.
Dan, any response to that?
I think that if ultimately some of these pushes to repeal the AUMS fail, I think it will embolden those who support the status quo around foreign policy. I know that's not really an operational impact per se. It's more of I guess, a public perception, PR consequence, but I think it is one that ultimately will make it harder to change our foreign policy. And I think it just will further entrench what has become the norm these past 20 years, in that Congress doesn't play a role in foreign policy except for largely rubber stamping what the executive branch does. Now, there have been a few attempts to stand up and by Congress and reassert itself in matters of war and peace, but the larger, more serious attempts, like around the AUMFs, that really hasn't happened the way it should have. And if these fail, again, I just think it's going to be harder and harder in the future to really rebalance this relationship. And I just say is that we've kind of gotten at this, but I think it's important just to say this very directly, is I think there's this myth in a lot of Americans' minds that the executive branch is responsible for foreign policy and the executive branch alone. That's not how the founders wanted it to be. The way the Constitution is written, in both, declaring war, but also appropriations, in budgeting and appropriations, it is very clear that Congress is supposed to be a co-equal partner in foreign policy. And that was something that's part of the brilliance of our founding fathers. And I don't think it's a coincidence, as we've given the executive branch more leeway in foreign policy, our foreign policy has gotten worse. And so I think that it's very important that we rebalance this relationship between Congress and the executive branch and foreign policy. And if we fail in this push, I'm worried about our ability to do it in the future.
Yeah. Gentlemen, we're just about out of time, but I do want to give you each a chance to just have any closing remarks that you have. Also, where folks can find you online. Dan, I'll let you go first. Where can folks find you?
Yeah, so you can find me mainly on Twitter at Dan D. Caldwell. And then obviously follow Concerned Veterans for America on Twitter at Concerned Vets, and on the Concerned Veterans Facebook page. It's the best way to stay in touch with us. So I just wanted to close on something. So I've obviously been very critical of the Iraq war in this conversation. And I'm not afraid to say that I think it's one of the worst foreign policy decisions in American history, and might actually, in retrospect, turn out to be the worst. That doesn't mean that I am not in awe of the individual skill and bravery of a lot of the servicemen and women that were sent to fight in that conflict. You saw a lot of soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen doing incredible things in that conflict, really stepping up to the plate in ways that you had never seen the American fighting man and women in throughout history, being responsible for things, managing cities and towns and fighting a complex enemy and constantly having to readjust your tactics and being something like an artilleryman, but then being a military police officer or being a civil affairs person. And it was really incredible to see them time and again step up to the plate. And I'm from 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, and I remember joining that unit and just kind of being in awe of a lot of the Marines I served with, because 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines was in the first Battle of Fallujah. You had Major Doug Zimbeck, the line of Fallujah. You had the Fox 2-1 Marines in Operation Steel Curtain. A guy in my company got a Navy Cross, and they're incredible Marines. And I just am so lucky to have served and met those people and known those people. I think that ultimately we were set up to fail, but still we did our best, and time again, showed that the American military can accomplish a lot, but that doesn't mean that it can solve every problem in the world. And when you misuse it, you fail those incredible men and women that do things like charge into fortified buildings where you have 100 or not 100, but like a dozen mujahideen that are just setting up to kill you, and you run in time and again, not knowing if you're come out alive, diving on grenades, going back 2, 3, 4 times for a tour. That the failure of the Iraq War does not diminish the bravery of those individuals. And I wanted to close on that point because it's very important to me that I make that. And again, I'm hugely critical of the war, but a lot of those guys still remain my heroes and the guys I look up to.
Well said, Dan. Thank you for sharing that. I couldn't agree more. Jason, I'll pass it to you for a last word. Any last comments that you have?
Sure. Yeah, no, Dan, really, you hit the mark there. So many men and women that we walked with in conflict or in harm's way leave us profoundly humbled. And we have a lot of honor for folks that did incredible work. And just like you, the real sort of purpose here, the leverage is when service members are given clear tasks, clear objectives that are within the roles and the responsibilities of the Department of Defense and the military at large, we have the best fighting force ever. When they're challenged to do things that are ambiguous and vague and require a sense of a person's idea or motive, when you get down to the rank and file and you're close in on combat or quarters with the enemy, those are really difficult things for anyone to accomplish. So we have to be very careful when we do utilize this force. And the only way that's going to happen is when really we, the people, stand together to demand answers. There's nothing partisan about expecting our legislators, congressmen and women, presidents, cabinet secretaries to provide us a sort of reason for why we're doing what we're doing. And that builds the confidence that is comforting to men and women who have to bury their sons and daughters as we take them back from the battlefield. And don't forget, the direct costs of war are pretty significant, but the indirect costs of war are huge. And you all of us here today, at least in this session that I know you men, all of us have friends who have been struggling with the things that are left with you after these conflicts. And so if we're not really careful about sharing our resource, our treasure, the best treasure the United States of America can have for just kind of ambiguous reasons, then we will pay the indirect consequences. And I'd like to see that actually circumscribed. The only way we're going to do that is when we are actually heard in the halls of Washington, D.C. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. this is great. Nobody does this. This is the kind of way we get our voices heard. And it has to be on important issues like this. So thank you for sharing with my members. We're with the Association of the United States Navy. You can find us on Facebook. That's AUSN, the number 1. That's our Facebook handle. For Twitter, it's AUSN_Navy. AUSN_Navy. And then if you see us on Twitter, that's Instagram. Twitter's AUSN tweets. So just find us, join us. We're starting a new thing with how do we want to take your voice to the Hill, and whether it's CVA, us, other VSOs out there that you trust or been a part of, you deserve the answers that you want. The only way we're going to get those answers, though, is if we press and advocate and press and advocate. It's hard. It takes a long time. So you didn't shrink from leadership to go overseas and take care of the enemy. Don't shrink from leadership in the civic front. We're needing you more now here than you were ever needed over there, because this is where my daughters grow up. This is where your sons and daughters grow up. And so if we don't survive the Republic with a strong military that knows itself and understands its capabilities and limitations, then we're risking that Republic. So I'll end with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. And congratulations on your role, Executive Director, AUSN.
Thank you.
Great organization. They're in good hands with you, I trust. Thank you for joining us also. Dan, thank you. To everybody watching, I hope this was valuable to you. Dan already plugged CVA, but I'll do it one more time. Our website is cv4a.org. We're on Twitter @ConcernedVets and Facebook @ConcernedVets for America. If you like what you heard tonight and you want to get involved, you want to do something about it, I want to give a plug for a special program that we have live right now. It's called the End Endless Wars Project. And if you want to learn a little bit more about it, maybe take action, maybe have your voice heard a little bit, go to the website, endendlesswars.com. Check it out. I really invite you to check it out. And even if it's just to learn a little bit more. But like we've been talking about in this program, it's critically important that people like us, veterans, our families, military families, have their voices heard, because these are very important issues, not just our community, but all of Americans and of the next generation also. So we got to have our voices heard, and we've got to put ourselves out there to do that. And that's what we're doing. So thank you for joining us, folks. Until next time, gentlemen, let's do this again.
Thanks. Thank you both.
Thank you, Nate.
Thank you, everybody.
See you, Jason.
Have a good night.
All right.